What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, back with the second week of fantasy football stardom and situm for 2020. Quarterbacks, running backs, wide receiver, tight ends, and defenses. My starts and my sits at every position. Before I give you my stardom, my situm for week number 2 of the 2020 fantasy season, make sure you do Gronk Spike the like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL videos and fantasy stardom and situm videos each and every week. Comment below your questions regarding your starts and your sits for week number 2 of the 2020 fantasy season. I'll be sure to respond to them on Friday or Saturday in a video where I go question by question and give you the analysis on who you should start and who you should sit. So make sure you do get those questions in at the very latest before Saturday so that I can reply to every comment and give you the information to help you win in week number 2. Week number 2's here. We already have a week down, so we have a little bit more information to base this off of. Let's kick it off, as always, with the quarterback position. Quarterback position this week, my starts. I'm going with the old reliables here. Drew Brees versus the Las Vegas Raiders. He plays on Monday Night Football. Don't get discouraged about two things. He played the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense last week. I'm very high on the Bucs defense. I think not enough people know that it actually is one of the better defenses in the NFL from a speed perspective, from a pass rush perspective, and a very underrated secondary with fantastic coaching. Brees did struggle there, but now he is up against the Vegas Raiders defense that got shredded by Teddy Bridgewater and this Carolina offense that was implementing a new system. For Drew Brees, he plays in a similar system to Teddy Bridgewater, only he's a better quarterback than Bridgewater. He has better weapons than Bridgewater. He has a better coordinator than Bridgewater, and the scheme just overall is much better. He should have 300 yards. He should have multiple touchdowns and bounce back on Monday night versus the Raiders. Tom Brady versus the Carolina Panthers. Speaking about those two quarterbacks that went head-to-head last weekend, Tom Brady should bounce back on Sunday versus Carolina. I just spoke about the Raiders and Carolina. Those two teams are terrible on defense. I think this is a game from last week that a lot of people are going to inflate what happened. I think both of these teams are not very good, specifically on the defensive side of the football. The Raiders struggle to get after the quarterback. The Panthers are the same. They also are probably the worst, less proven secondary in the NFL, and they have many, many young players. Whether Chris Godwin is in or out, I don't really think it matters. Plus, just the way Tom Brady is approaching the media this week, it seems like he really wants this win and seems like really motivated to put up a lot of points versus Carolina. And I'm sure that the Bucs want to answer a lot of the questions that they left on the field in New Orleans. Matt Ryan versus Dallas. Dallas's defense didn't look so hot last week versus the Rams. They didn't give up a ton of yardage in the passing game, but Matt Ryan looked like Matt Ryan in week number 1 versus Seattle. 3 100-yard receivers for Atlanta in that game. Yes, they were coming from behind, but they might have to do that versus Dallas, who also has a great offense. Dak Prescott should put up a lot of yardage versus Matt Ryan's defense, meaning Ryan, whether he's winning this game, he'll have success, or if he's coming back and throwing, he's going to have success for fantasy at the very least. Dallas' secondary is questionable at best, and their pass rush didn't look too fantastic versus an offensive line that's probably not much better than Atlanta's in LA. Phillip Rivers plays Minnesota. I'm going to start mostly every quarterback that plays the Vikings this season. Their secondary is completely unproven and got absolutely filleted by Aaron Rodgers in week 1. They have so much young talent that really they don't know what they're doing. The speed is lacking, and Rivers did look better than people want to give him credit for in week 1 versus Jacksonville. I actually believe that Jacksonville's pass defense, especially with Danielle Hunter out for Minnesota, is better than the Vikings. Rivers is probably the stream of the week that you can pick up and start in week number 2. My quarterback sits this week. Deshaun Watson versus Baltimore. Watson's incredible, but if you do have a solid backup with a good matchup, I'd consider sitting him. Watson is playing Baltimore, who he struggled against last season. Baltimore has a fantastic secondary. They know how to create pressure. They blitz at the highest rate in the NFL. And Deshaun Watson has yet to get on the same page with everyone not named Will Fuller. I'm worried about him early this season. I think this might be a blowout versus Baltimore in a bad way for Watson. And I don't think that means a lot of fantasy points. Baker Mayfield versus Cincinnati. I know a lot of people are expecting a bounce back this week. I just don't think he's good. I think he's terrible. He looked terrible last week versus a much better defense in Baltimore, but I do think people are sleeping on Cincinnati's defense that did play well versus the Chargers. They have an improved secondary all around. Jesse Bates, William Jackson looked very good, as well as Alexander, and their pass rush is still quality. I feel Baker Mayfield, the Browns, they're going to run the football instead of pass it a ton. I would sit Mayfield once again. Jimmy G versus the Jets. Jimmy I had as a start last week. He was the most disappointing start that I had versus Arizona. And I'm concerned that he doesn't have enough weapons around him, specifically at receiver, now that George Kittle is also banged up. Yes, the Jets are a good matchup for quarterbacks, but he just doesn't have a lot around him to really put up the big yardage totals that you want to ask from your fantasy quarterback. I'd go elsewhere. And Jared Goff versus Philadelphia. This is the difference for me between last week and this week. The Eagles' defensive line is going to lock down the running game of the Rams, forcing Goff into bad passing situations where it takes the play action element away from his game. Whenever that happens, the Rams, and specifically Jared Goff in that offense, they struggle. The Eagles also have an improved secondary where Darius Slay looked very good last week. I think the Eagles play very well defensively and slow down that Rams offense. My running back starts. Adrian Peterson versus the Packers. He looked awesome last week. The Hall of Fame running back is still getting enough carries and enough touches to warrant to start him versus the Packers. The Packers also have to be concerned that their best interior defensive lineman and one of the best in the NFL, Kenny Clark, is injured and probably not going to play this week versus Detroit. Peterson is the power runner of this backfield, at least so far. He outperformed Kerryon Johnson. DeAndre Swift had the disappointing drop at the end of the game. I don't think they trust him quite yet, meaning Peterson's going to get a lot of work. They also want to keep Rodgers on the sideline. I think it's a run-heavy approach for Detroit. I'd start Peterson. Ronald Jones versus Carolina. Ronald Jones took a majority of the snaps for the Bucs backfield as a receiver and a runner. He actually looked pretty good independent from his offensive line play versus the Saints. Saints were a much, much tougher matchup. Carolina is weak versus the run. They don't have a good linebacking core like they used to with Luke Kuechly because he's no longer there. And their defensive line is lackluster. I think Ronald Jones probably scores 1, maybe even 2 touchdowns in this game. Miles Sanders versus the LA Rams. Miles Sanders is back. He is healthy. That means you start him. I think the Eagles are going to make a much better effort to run the football this week after they basically lost the game to Washington because they did not run it enough. The Rams also were very deceptive to Zeke last week running the football. I think Sanders can find similar success. Todd Gurley versus Dallas. Gurley looked pretty good in his opportunities last week. Yes, you do have to be concerned about them getting away from the running game so quickly when they were down, but I expect this game versus Dallas to be a little bit closer. I do think Gurley could score a touchdown here, and I do think Dallas is weaker versus the run than Seattle. So I think Gurley is still a start here in week number 2. My running back sits. James Conner versus Denver. James Conner is a guy that is coming off injury. He's expected to play, but even if he does play, I'd look to go somewhere else because Denver is very good versus the run. They have a bunch of big dudes in the middle of their defense. They were fantastic versus Derrick Henry. And Pittsburgh struggled to run the football versus the Giants. I expect that to be the same versus the Broncos. Whether Connor is injured or not, I just don't see it as a great matchup with not a lot of upside. Malcolm Brown was fantastic in his first game as basically the starter for the Rams backfield. But just like I said, Philadelphia is a phenomenal run defense with Fletcher Cox, Malik Jackson in the middle. I just don't see Brown having the same success he had versus Dallas. Devin Singletary versus Miami. I do not trust Singletary. Last week, he stunk for fantasy purposes. Yes, that was versus the Jets, who are one of the better run defenses in the NFL. But Miami isn't too shabby. I think Josh Allen is going to have much more success than his backs once again this week running the football. And Zach Moss is the guy I'd rather start. He is more of the receiver and the red zone weapon for this offense. DeAndre Swift, I'm keeping him on my bench until he proves to me in a game that he is their real legitimate starter and at least getting enough touches to warrant starting him as a flex player. I'm still off of Swift right now. He might be the Miles Sanders of last year where he's just basically not startable until he finally gains that role and that job. My wide receiver starts. Marquise Brown versus Houston. Houston has a terrible secondary. They gave up some big plays versus Kansas City, but they were very, very cautious in their defense last week, allowing a lot of underneath stuff. So either way, Marquise Brown could hit the big play versus Houston because Houston will be overcompensated trying to stop Lamar Jackson. Houston's already in a bad spot in that regard because they're very slow up front, causing Lamar Jackson's quickness to give them a lot of issues. If they stack the box to stop Lamar, Marquise Brown probably scores 1 or 2 big play touchdowns. And if they don't, then hey, Marquise Brown could feast underneath on third downs, probably move him around and get him a lot of receptions in yak plays. So either way, I think Marquise Brown is quickly becoming a weekly start option at the wide receiver position. Paris Campbell versus Minnesota. I was impressed with what I saw versus Jacksonville. He played better than T.Y. Hilton in that game. He's going to be their primary slot receiver this year. And if you picked him up and spent some fab on him, I'd start him versus Minnesota. A secondary that, like I said with Rivers, is very unproven and just not very good. They also lack speed. What Paris Campbell does not lack is speed. It's just an advantage. He'll see a lot of targets here, and I do think he is a wide receiver 3 this week. Emmanuel Sanders versus the Las Vegas Raiders. He's going to be taking place of Michael Thomas in a lot of the slot role, the underneath role, and Drew Brees. He's a veteran receiver. They're going to have continuity, chemistry. Sanders knows where to go, knows where to be, and he's going to rack up the receptions this week versus a Raiders secondary that's one of the worst in the game. Scotty Miller versus Carolina. Now, this is an injury designation here. Chris Godwin is in concussion protocol. He is yet to practice this week. If he does not play, Scotty Miller becomes a must-start versus Carolina. Carolina is a terrible defense. Terrible secondary. Henry Ruggs did very well. Scotty Miller is actually a pretty similar receiver to Henry Ruggs with actually similar speed and quickness. He also has great chemistry, maybe the best chemistry with Tom Brady out of all the receivers in Tampa Bay. So he becomes an interesting starting option if Evans or Godwin do not play each and every week. My wide receiver sits. Brandon Cooks versus Baltimore. He just lacks chemistry with his quarterback right now. Did not perform well versus Kansas City. Was pretty much invisible. I don't expect that to change versus one of the best secondaries in the NFL. Devontae Parker versus Buffalo. He's going to see another tough matchup going from Gilmore to Tre'Davious White, who's arguably the second best cornerback behind Gilmore in the NFL. And he is injured. So he might not even play here. So definitely pay attention to the details. If Parker does play, maybe you start him as your wide receiver 3, but I would not expect a high ceiling versus one of the best defenses in the NFL, specifically one of the best corners in the NFL who's going to track him all over the field. DK Metcalf. I love Metcalf this year. I loved him in week 1, but that does not mean I love him in week 2. He's largely going to see Stephon Gilmore. And if he doesn't, he's going to see a lot of J.C. Jackson and a double team. So either way, he's in trouble in terms of production this week. New England has the best secondary in the NFL. Belichick takes away what you do best. What they do best in Seattle is Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, and DK Metcalf. I expect Metcalf to be out of this game plan. Now, maybe you still start him because he's that great, but just don't expect a lot from Metcalf. A.J. Brown versus Jacksonville. This might be a little surprising. He isn't practicing right now, though, so you definitely have to be concerned about the injuries. He didn't look like himself on Monday versus Denver, so that's also concerning. And C.J. Henderson, the rookie, looked phenomenal versus T.Y. Hilton. So I'm a little concerned about A.J. Brown's matchup this week. My tight end starts. Tyler Higbee versus the Eagles. Higbee is a great athlete. He's a great route runner, knows how to get open. And yeah, his week 1 performance wasn't great, but this week he plays the Eagles, who are just not good versus tight ends. I mean, Logan Thomas even had a decent day for Washington. Higbee is a much better player. Everett is banged up. Higbee will see more snaps. And the linebacker position for the Eagles is just non-existent. So Higbee's an easy start for me. Jared Cook is maybe the start of the week at tight end. Considering that Michael Thomas is not there, Brees is going to be looking for him in the red zone. Sean Payton will be scheming him up much more just between the 20s in general. And I believe this is the big play guy for this offense, if I'm being honest. So Jared Cook could have another touchdown. He could have a big play in this game, and he could be a big start. I think the Michael Thomas injury benefits Jared Cook owners the most. O.J. Howard versus Carolina. Now, this is an interesting one. This is not a start in all leagues, but if you're in a deeper league, or maybe you have George Kittle, who might or may play. Really not sure yet. He may or may not. If he doesn't, O.J. Howard is a guy I'm looking at with a really juicy matchup, and he did look better than Gronk last week. He also ran more routes, even though he was on the field less. It seems like they're using Gronk more as a blocker than a receiver. Howard had a good camp. He had a good week 1, scoring a touchdown versus a good defense, and now he plays a juicy matchup. Keep your eye out for that. Dallas Goedert versus the LA Rams. The Rams, just like the Eagles, have terrible linebackers. They cannot cover in space, and honestly, Dallas Goedert is continuing to impress me, maybe even being the better player than Zach Ertz at this point. My tight end sits. Noah Fant versus Pittsburgh. Doesn't matter who's covering him. Pittsburgh is vicious over the middle. Fant is just not going to see a lot of targets because this defense is so good. And I really expect the Broncos to target Sutton if he's back in the lineup and Jerry Jeudy with the advantage in the slot. I think Fant becomes kind of more of a red zone / big play option, but very inconsistent. He could have maybe one big play in this game, but outside of that, I just don't see it. Chris Herndon may see volume versus the 49ers, but again, just like the Bills, this is too good of a defense to allow him to do anything more when he's legitimately their best option. Like, okay, if Jamison Crowder's out for this game, you would consider starting him because he's their only option. But is that even a good thing? Because now San Francisco is just going to hone in on stopping Herndon. Greg Olsen versus New England. Olsen did have a decent week 1 and actually looks like a piece of this offense. But Jawan Williams completely shut down Mike Gesicki in week 1. He was drafted to be a tight end stopper in the 2nd round 1 season ago for the Patriots. Bill Belichick has designed and pretty much made him in a lab to defend tight ends. I expect him to take away Olsen, the old man, in this game. And Austin Hooper versus Cincinnati. Again, guys, Cincinnati's secondary is better than you think. Whether it's Von Bell, Jesse Bates, or maybe one of their underrated backers, I don't think Hooper's going to go off in this game. Maybe he has a fluky touchdown or a couple catches, but I don't see him having a ton of success. He will become more relevant down the stretch, though, now that Njoku is kind of no longer in this offense. My defense starts to end it off. My defense starts Arizona defense versus Washington. The football team simply does not have a good offense. I understand they played the Eagles, they won, they had a comeback, but Arizona's defense looked pretty good versus a much better schemed offense with Kyle Shanahan, much better, more talented offense in San Francisco. Arizona could stop the run versus San Francisco, which is not easy. And really, there's no receivers outside of Terry McLaurin to be afraid of, and they do have Patrick Peterson on their side. So I just think this is a great start with potential turnover fest and Chandler Jones going off here for sacks. Arizona is a sneaky start. If they're out in your league, definitely pick them up. Tampa Bay's defense versus Carolina. I understand Carolina played well offensively versus the Raiders, and they may put up more points in garbage time this week, but Tampa Bay's defense is just really, really good, and we saw that last week. They seem to have a very good handle of this scheme. Carolina's scheme is basically a watered-down version of New Orleans, and I expect Tampa to be all over their money ball concepts. And then you got the New York Giants. Their defense, I understand, is not very good. But I think anytime you play Mitchell Trubisky, especially after a game where everyone thinks he looks great, probably means he's going to bounce back with a terrible performance. I'm just being honest. So if you're out there and you really don't see a matchup you like, maybe you're stuck in a bad spot, I think taking a flyer on the Giants defense, considering I like their creativity in week 1 versus Big Ben, they were getting after the quarterback, they were causing bad decisions. I don't think this is a terrible play at all versus Chicago. An offense that just isn't good. So there you guys go. Those are my starts and my sits for week number 2 of the 2020 NFL fantasy season. If you enjoyed, again, Gronk, spike that like button and subscribe for more fantasy football. It's Mitch. Leave your questions below. Enjoy another fantasy week. Peace.